My name is Christy Lopez. I am a professor at Georgetown Law, and I was previously at the U.S. Department of Justice in the Civil Rights Division, investigating law enforcement agencies.
Great. And you did a lot of work in Ferguson, correct?
Yeah, I led that investigation.
Well, thank you for that. So if you could, we're going to be talking a little bit today about your work related to Ferguson, but also in pattern and practice investigations, consent decrees, and an article you wrote on carceral logic. Could you outline for us what you mean by carceral logic and kind of what police, how police factor into a larger system of punishment, discipline, control, this kind of thing?
Yeah, what I mean by carceral logic is a logic that wasn't invented by police, but we ask police to carry it out and to operate under that logic. And it's a logic that presumes that the safest way or the most effective way to protect public safety is to coerce and control people rather than to serve the public, to determine what people's needs are, and best you can to meet those needs. And importantly, I think it's a logic that really is a through line in American history, really stemming from the days when we enslaved people, and then when people were freed from slavery, there was an attempt to continue that control. There was a fear of what would happen if you didn't continue that actual physical bodily control of people. And that through line has really infected how we think about a lot of things in our country, including how we think about public safety. And so that logic has shifted forms throughout the years, but it unfortunately, tragically, really, it has persisted. And today, one of the main purveyors of that logic, trying to carry out public safety primarily through coercion, physical bodily coercion and control, are the police.
And it's interesting because I think when you frame it in this way, the police are less about safety and more about other societal functions. And one of the things that you point out in another article is that the police aren't really here to serve and protect. There's other things that they provide, the carceral society or the logic. And the reason I'm asking this is I want to get at why some of these abuses happen and how we get to a point where the police are abusing us and not so much protecting us.
Yeah, no, I think that many communities, including Black and Latina communities, do expect the police to be there to serve and protect. Many individuals in those communities are very disappointed because that expectation is not met. But there's still, I think, an expectation, and I personally think an appropriate one, that the police should, a role that they serve is to protect. There are sort of precipitous harm and violence that happens, and we need someone to rush towards that rather than away from that. Police can and should fill that role. The problem is that because policing has also been charged with this task of maintaining this racialized social order, and a lot of institutions in the U.S. have been tasked with maintaining a racialized social order, but the police function within that has been to do so using force and coercion, right? And so when you're the ones charged with that unique and particular task, it's really hard to shift gears and to be perceived as shifting gears, to be the helper, to be assisting, to be doing the vast array of additional tasks we've asked police to carry out, responding to people in mental health crisis, responding to neighborhood disputes, to traffic accidents, a number of things that really, it's nice to have government help do those things. But when you have an agency whose function has been so focused on coercion and control, and you try to get them to expand to such an amorphous set of tasks, it's inevitable that one of those, one set of those tasks is not going to be prioritized. They're not going to do it as well. And with policing, it's been the ones that don't involve coercion and force, the ones that involve protecting and serving people, or I'll say serving people, and helping people.
And I think part of that is this over-policing of certain communities and how that happens, because you would think that if police are in an area, it's because there's a high crime area, but the police presence makes a high crime area, right? And that's kind of what we're talking about, right? This over-policing of minority communities.
Yeah, you're precisely right. And I think it's also important I think it's helpful to think about over-policing in conjunction with under-policing when we're talking about carceral logic, because people don't understand why there's so many police in my neighborhood constantly watching me, making me feel like I'm being, like they are suspecting me of something. And yet when I call to get their help, they either don't come, or they wait too long to arrive. Or when they do arrive, they can't actually help me with what I need. Well, that's because they're not actually there to help you with what you need. They're there to send a message of control, of you are being watched, don't do anything wrong, we're here. There is a very real attitude, and I know this from riding along with police and from talking to police for decades, that they are in a community that is full of people ready to commit crimes, and they are there to try to keep them from doing so. Now, not all police are like that for sure, but that's definitely a thread that runs through the culture of a lot of policing. And it's because of this history, because we've asked police to do that. So they're over-policing in that way, surveilling, watching, waiting for someone to do something wrong. But when you actually come to a police officer, call a police officer, hey, I need help, they're not there to help you. That's not the way they see you often as a member of this community, as someone who needs help. They see you as a suspect. Or even if they do, and many officers really do want to help the people that they are policing in the communities they are policing, but they don't have the resources to do so. That's not actually, they can't give you what you need, which may have much more to do with healthcare or education or food or housing than anything the police have to offer. So you get this over-policing, under-policing dynamic that is rooted completely in this carceral logic.
And I really want to kind of unpack this carceral logic, because I think you make a really strong point, which I want to talk about at the end, about what can be done to address some of this. And I think one of the things that you were talking about is the idea that the police show up with kind of one tool in their toolkit. Every hammer sees a problem as a nail, and you're in kind of looking at the defund the police movement, you come to some conclusions, and I want to get to those. But first, I think we can move into why the federal government needs to be involved in local policing problems. So you talk about how local policing is unique to America and what the federal role can be. I think that's an important distinction that not a lot of people understand or think about.
Yeah, so policing in the United States is somewhat unique in how decentralized it is, and that there's no overarching set of rules that applies to all police. The closest thing we have is the U.S. Constitution, which I think in part because there isn't a national set of rules, has been kind of turned into a sort of a pseudo-regulatory structure. But it's not particularly, for all police, but it's not particularly well suited for that. It's the terms of it are very general. It can't get at the minutia that you confront every day as a police officer, and it's developed by judges with very little input from real people living these experiences, either as police officers or as people being policed or other members of the community. So it just, there's a lot of these standards that can be helpful, but they're certainly insufficient, and sometimes they're not very helpful. But at best, they're insufficient to give us the sort of the regulatory structure, the set of rules that would help us ensure that policing is consistently fair and consistently effective. equitable across the country. So I think that's, one objective, or I'm not sure it's a stated objective, but certainly one consequence, a result of the U.S. Department of Justice going into local police departments across the country, is that they can sort of insert a more consistent nationwide set of standards or practices that should be done everywhere. Because what they are doing is they're going into police departments and they are discovering all these violations and really working hard to figure out why these violations are happening, and then trying to come up with remedies to prevent those violations from occurring in the future. And they see differences everywhere they go, and they see, things that are the same everywhere they go. And through that body of knowledge, they learn a lot about how things should change, about what those sorts of regulations should be. And through their consent decrees and through their technical assistance and other forms of guidance they can provide, it can help spread those ideas. And I think that the investigative function of the Civil Rights Division is a really important part of that, because that's where it's the only part of the Department of Justice that really delves deeply into what's causing violations of people's rights and tries to figure out why. And so that really informs this set of rules that can apply to everyone.
And what would bring the Department of Justice into a police department? I mean, I think we've seen some high profile, Derek Chauvin and George Floyd for one, but what would be the catalyst to alert the Department of Justice to actually do one of these investigations?
Yeah, so the type of investigation that you're talking about, a pattern or practice investigation that's conducted by the Civil Rights Division, it's not complaint driven. So it's not as though if people file a complaint with the Department of Justice, they're required to conduct an investigation. They have a lot of discretion over where they investigate and what they investigate them for. And there are always many more agencies that could be investigated because there appears to be a pattern or practice of civil rights violations, then they have the resources to investigate. So they have to make a lot of hard choices and try to conduct investigations that will allow their work to have the most impact. The ways the cases come to their attention, it can be something like in Memphis, where they may have already been looking at Memphis for sure, but in Memphis when Tyree Nichols was killed, that provoked an international, outcry and attention on Memphis Police Department, and certainly that's almost certainly what sparked the investigation that they recently announced in Memphis. In other instances, there may be an advocacy group that compiles a list of affidavits or just letters from community members about what their experience has been with the police department. My recollection is that our investigation of Newark, New Jersey was in large part instigated by the ACLU's collection of stories of individuals and community groups, collection of stories of individuals' experience with the Newark Police Department. Or there may be a series of investigative news reports that really shines a light on a particular police department in a way that indicates there might be some patterns of problems there, some routine practices that are causing rights violations. So a number of different ways that a department can come to the attention of the Department of Justice. But recently, it has quite often been a high-profile tragic incident that has turned their attention to a particular city.
And once one of these investigations, pattern or practice investigations is launched, what kind of information do you find that turns these police departments into a culture of misconduct, basically?
Well, a lot of things, and over time, what I found are a lot of patterns or sort of dynamics that caused me to start thinking more about carceral logic and some of these fundamental assumptions about policing. Because certainly what you see is you may see problems with how police officers are being recruited. The standards are too low, and people who really, don't have the temperament to be police officers are being recruited. Poor supervision, certainly poor accountability. When police officers do something wrong, they aren't investigated appropriately or disciplined appropriately. And pretty soon, no one's really supervising you. No one seems to care if you mess up. And you don't really have a very good sense and don't really care about these people anyway. And if there's enough of those type of people in the department, that becomes the culture, and that's how they police. And so I certainly saw that happen. I saw that dynamic in a lot of the police departments we were operating in over the years I was there.
Yeah, because I think one of and thank you for that, because that's important, because I think the response is always, well, it's just a few bad apples. But when you do one of these, not you personally, but when a pattern and practice investigation is conducted, the things they uncover is it's not just a few bad apples, right? It's more of a systemic kind of the way the department's being run,
Yeah. No, I think the thing that's I've always found confounding about that I don't know, excuse is, just a few bad apples, is that the saying, of course, is actually one bad apple can ruin the whole barrel. And that's what we actually find in our investigations, is that there were a few too many bad apples that were allowed to stay in the barrel for too long, and now the whole barrel is infected, right? And so there are, no matter, I believe that no matter however high your standards are, whatever accountability measures you have, you can't 100% guarantee that you're not going to have a terrible incident, or that a terrible officer, someone who just maybe a fine person but should never be a police officer, gets into your agency. And so one of the things we would really look for in those investigations is what are the mechanisms you have in place to detect problems like that, and what is your response when something like that happens? If it's sort of shrug, oh well, that's policing, well, that tells us a lot. But if it's, oh my, this cannot happen, this is intolerable, and those aren't just words, here's our actions backing that up, that tells a very different story. That tells you whether this is an agency that's interested in getting those bad apples out of the barrel, or allowing them to stay there and infect the whole thing.
Well, and I'm forgetting the jurisdiction, but there was one investigation in which the policing was not so much even about policing, it was more about revenue generation. And can you kind of give us an idea of how local and city government also informs how policing is expected, or what they're expecting the police to do, not the citizens, but kind of the city itself and as revenue generators? And
yeah, so that's a really important question. And there is a distinction between what city leaders do and what citizens do. But I do want to point out that a lot of times what city leaders do is because they're being pressured to do so, or certainly at least allowed to do so by a majority of the population, which, I think should give us all some pause about our own role in ensuring that we have policing that is fair and equitable, and also indicates that sometimes majoritarian democracies, democratic processes, are not going to protect people whose rights are being violated. And that's certainly what we saw in Ferguson. So I think what we found in Ferguson was that the city there were two things going on, and this is where I started to. I'm not sure I had the term. No, I didn't have the term yet. But where the idea of carceral logic really started to take root in my mind, it didn't come from a place of sort of ideology or sort of theoretical musing by me. It was just sort of a very practical trying to understand what I was seeing. And what I saw in Ferguson was that they were using poor people and Black people who were poor and Black to raise revenue for their city. They were literally funding their city by ticketing these individuals and making it very difficult for them to pay off those tickets so that fines would build up. And not just poor people, Black people, but also just the people who are very vulnerable, people with mental illnesses, people who were unsheltered, like people who just really, the people they should have been working to take care of, they were instead exploiting those vulnerabilities to make money. And I wondered how they could do this, and also how they could get away with doing this, and what motivated them to do this. And I realized, we all, I think, realized, but I won't speak for others on my team, that it was not just to raise revenue, but it was also to retain a control over a segment of the community that they were afraid of. Ferguson had gone from majority white to majority Black over a relatively short time period of about 10 years. And there was a sense we had to keep people in line to preserve our way of life in Ferguson, and heavily ticketing people and heavily policing how they did everything, including how they crossed the streets and whether they walked on the sidewalk or not. That became a matter of police importance. And so it served those two functions, those two objectives dovetailed very nicely. We can keep control of these people who we are not, who we are afraid of. We feel this racialized social order falling apart, and that worries us. And we can raise money off of this. And how do we do that? Through the agency that we've always, throughout history in America, asked to do that, the police. And so that's exactly what they did.
And then we all know the disruption that causes in poor people's lives when you can't pay and you're then incarcerated and lose jobs and housing, so on and so forth.
Yeah, the cascading effects of that are really impossible to calculate or to overstate.
And how do you address kind of so the Department of Justice can come in, do these investigations, and then what would be the outcome of one of these investigations? So when you worked on Ferguson, you did this investigation, then what was the next step?
Yeah, so one of the things you are doing during the investigation, it's not only to determine whether there is a pattern or practice of violations of individual rights. You're also trying to figure out what's causing that pattern or practice, because you know that the next step is to come up with a remedy in the form of what we call injunctive relief, not money, but things we're going to actually ask the department to do. And you're trying to figure out what those things should be. And what we learned in the early days of enforcing the statute is that these couldn't be voluntary agreements where we're just asking the department to do these things, but these things need to be set out in a court order, and a court's going to say you have to do these things. That's the only chance you have of any of it getting even partly done. That's not entirely true. Some things will get done if it's voluntary, but it's usually the easy stuff. And usually the hard stuff is causing the most harm. So what we would do is we would use that investigation, try to figure out what was going on and how and why. And then we would seek, if we found that there was a pattern or practice of civil rights violations, and generally you do, because you really try hard not to go in and cause that kind of disruption in investigation if you don't think you've got something there to begin with. You would then we would write a findings report so that the whole world would know what we found and what we think was causing it. And then we would try to negotiate a settlement agreement, usually in the form of a consent decree. It gets issued as a court order. Most of the time, agencies would agree to negotiate a consent decree with us from the outset. In a couple of occasions, and Ferguson was one of them. Well, Ferguson was actually interesting because they agreed to negotiate a consent decree with us. And we spent about, 6 months or a year negotiating a consent decree with the leaders of Ferguson. And then when it came time for their city council to vote to reach an agreement with the Department of Justice, the city council, including many people we'd been negotiating with, voted against that. And so then we had to, sue them and spend several weeks suing them in federal court, which is something the statute the DOJ operates under gives the Civil Rights Division the authority to do. And eventually they capitulated and went back to where it should have been before and entered that consent decree. But that really gives you a sense of how resistant they were to making changes, and how really just sort of, offended they were that the federal government was asking them to respect people's civil rights.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question, which was how do localities and police departments interact with the investigation, and how much pushback is there during one of these pattern or investigation?
I think most people are surprised at how much cooperation we get, and that cooperation can be very genuine, and we agree there's a problem and we're not going to be able to fix it on our own. So yes, come in, tell us what's wrong, help us fix it. Or it can be sort of more resigned, this is going to happen. Hopefully some good can come out of it. How do we work with you on this? Or it can be very resistant. Usually the resistance comes from a place of sort of ideological opposition. Sheriff Joe Arpaio in Maricopa County put up fierce resistance. I think in Ferguson, it was largely sort of this resistance to having the federal government telling them what to do. And they just felt sort of so attacked in this tiny town under this international spotlight. And so when people sort of lose sight or don't care enough about the actual goals, which are, making sure that policing isn't violating people's rights, it's very easy to get pretty resistant. But even for those that are cooperative, it's hard. It's asking people to change some pretty fundamental practices. It's asking them to produce a lot of data that it might be embarrassing to them that they don't have in better shape. It's asking for things that are expensive, training people, developing new systems. And so it's not an easy thing. But honestly, I think that's why you need a federal mandate to get people to do it. Again, if it were easy, cities and counties would have done these things a long time ago, and we'd have a better system of public safety. It takes outsiders, I think, to come in and really force these sorts of changes that just haven't, for whatever reason, happened internally ever.
Right. And after consent decree is reached, the DOJ is out of it, or what is usually in a consent decree and who manages it?
Yeah, that's such a great question, because sometimes I felt my own bosses felt that DOJ was out of it after the consent decree was reached, right? You put all these resources into the investigation, you put all these resources into negotiating the consent decree. Oh, now there's a consent decree. Let's move on. But in fact, that's where, as I always like to remind my bosses at the Department of Justice, that's actually where the hard work begins, because now you have to try to make the changes that are mandated by the court. And again, those are difficult things to do. And so, and in some respects, no one's figured out how to make these changes. And so you really have to be committed to staying the course. And continuing to work with communities, continuing to pressure the jurisdictions, continuing to figure out what's working, what's not. And it's just not as attractive sometimes to the public, even to people internal to DOJ. They want to move on to something else. And they don't want to stay with a process that will often last many years, sometimes a decade, sometimes more, to fix a department that's been messed up, oftentimes for scores of decades.
And adversarially, how do you respond to critics who say, well, the DOJ, well, first, let's talk about this one. The DOJ has its own problems, as we saw during the Trump administration, as we saw during Bush administration, and then finally Obama and Biden seem to be doing things differently. But what about this federal government system and how it affects what the department does?
So there is a real difference, right, between a Department of Justice Civil Rights Division and a Department of Justice that's run under someone with, the professionalism and integrity of people like Obama and Biden, and compared to some of the other people that were put in place under President Trump, for example. And there's also a big difference if people just don't prioritize civil rights, like George Bush did not, either of the George Bushes. So there's going to be real differences from administration to administration. But with that said, there are certain consistent sort of features of the Department of Justice that, in my view, ensure that it will always be what I call pathologically moderate, right? It's just not going to be the innovative driver of the kind of dramatic change we need to see in public safety and in policing. And I think in some respects that's probably appropriate. I think that I think the Department of Justice could be a little bit less what we think of as moderate here in the United States and get a lot more good work done. But regardless, that's what we've got. And there's some utility in that. It really does. It takes that careful center path. And so that when it does decide that something, as it did in these recent findings reports regarding Louisville, Kentucky and Minneapolis, Minnesota, when they were saying things like, you are violating federal statutes by only sending the police in response to people in mental health crisis. That's not like a radical agency or like a litigating agency, advocacy group saying that. That's the pathologically moderate Department of Justice. So if they're saying it, like, that had to go through a lot of hoops, and people really had to be like, all right, this is where we are. And so I think there's utility in sort of the way that they move the ball forward, but there's also great limitations. And so no one should expect that the Department of Justice or a consent decree that is negotiated with the Department of Justice is going to create all the change and mandate and bring about all the change that we need in policing. and related to that, one of the reasons for that isn't just sort of the features within the Department of Justice, but the nature of the law and of this work. What these consent decrees are meant to do are to ensure that policing is lawful. And unfortunately, the law as it currently stands permits a lot of policing that's quite harmful. So we have to work in a lot of other ways to change the law and change their expectations of what policing is in order to bring about the kind of policing we want, beyond just trying to get changes that come about under consent decrees.
Well, and that leads to where I was going before I asked that question, which is kind of adversarially, how do you respond to people who say, well, the DOJ and Department of Justice and the Civil Rights Department are at the end of the day police, and they're kind of continuing on the carceral logic that we were talking about, and basically just bringing police departments up to a civil rights bar is still causing harm.
Yeah, no, I think that's largely true. That I mean, it's obviously true that the Department of Justice is the nation's largest law enforcement agency. There's a certain irony in that being the department that is trying to police other law enforcement agencies. But there is a certain amount of credibility and knowledge that comes with that I think can be useful. But again, they are not going to be the drivers of the kind of dramatic change we need in policing. And so what I would say to people who say, well, they're not going to solve everything, is you are right. And it really helps us understand our role as people outside the Department of Justice. So for example, the changes that I just mentioned in the Louisville and Minneapolis consent decrees, I'm sorry, findings reports, that said that it's a violation of the ADA to send only police officers to persons in mental health crisis. That came about in part because of the education that advocacy groups and mental health clinicians provided to the Department of Justice over the previous 2 or 3 years. Hey, this is not meeting people's needs. This is not what you should be doing. It's not what you need to do. There's a lot more that you can be doing to serve people's needs. And DOJ, all they did, and it's an important all they did, but all they did was learn from that and reflect that in their findings reports. So you can actually change the Department of Justice's work, even as you continue to do that work outside the Department of Justice. So I think that's really important. And so I think that the question of whether DOJ can do good is yes, it can. And the question of whether there's more to do besides the work that DOJ does is yes, there is. The question I'm not sure about the answer of is, well, how worth it is it then? We put a lot of resources into these investigations and this work of DOJ. Should we be putting those resources into other places instead? Would we be changing policing more effectively? And my tentative answer to that is I haven't seen the ability to do that. The argument for taking everything entirely out of DOJ and moving it elsewhere, simply because we haven't seen other things that can do that unique thing that DOJ does, which is get this court-ordered mandated relief that really does. We have evidence that it reduces harm. But I realize that there's a lot we don't know, number one, and that I'm certainly biased, number two. So I encourage, I really encourage people to really think about that question of what's the best response to the policing problems in my community and how much of that requires or would benefit from the resources that would be put into and come out of a DOJ investigation.
Well, and that kind of leads me to the final part of what I wanted to ask you about, which was the resource reallocation or the defunding of the police or abolitionist of this entire system. Where are we with that, and how can we engage with it in a way that not only kind of touches upon your carceral logic argument, but also kind of the practicality of the day-to-day?
Yeah, so I can't obviously speak for an entire movement, or actually really several movements, but I will just give you my sense of things and tell you where I am, with a lot of humility that I don't, I can't speak for others or know sort of a lot of the work that's being done. But I do think there are people who were abolitionists long before George Floyd was killed and who will remain abolitionists for a very long time. And they're very principled and they understand it. There are a lot of people who really sort of just heard the term and never fully understood it and quickly gave it up. In the years of 2020, 2021. But I think that because of a lot of work that a lot of people did, a lot of activists, a lot of educators, for a long time, but certainly in the years between Ferguson and George Floyd's murder, they were able to really educate and change the thinking of a broad swath of Americans of the United States on what we need to be safe, what public safety should look like. And I think that's changed, and I hope it's changed permanently. As I mentioned, that's reflected in these DOJ findings reports that you should be sending people who are not the police to people in mental health crisis. If you poll people on this, a majority of people in the United States, Republicans or Democrats, will tell you that they're comfortable with someone besides the police responding to someone in mental health crisis. A high portion of calls to the police involve mental health crisis. So that's a fundamental shift in how we think about the role of police and how we think about responding to the needs of people in the public and about public safety. Delinking what the public needs to be saved from a police response. We need to expand that out so that people understand that there's a lot of situations besides mental health crisis that you don't need to have the police respond to that they're currently responding to. But I think we've like, oh, no one believes in defund anymore. We really underestimate the impact that's had, the import that's had. And I just hope it's definitely taken hold in a lot of larger departments, and I hope it continues to take root in those departments and then spread to other agencies as well.
That's hopeful, but then you kind of offer the argument too that some of our social work and interventionist, like drug courts, while they're good intentioned, ultimately fall back into this carceral logic kind of punishment motif, and not motif, but actual system. So how do we challenge that? How do we change the culture and get to, so when it's a good step not to have the police respond, but if a social worker is responding with the same hammer, just a little bit smaller, what's going on?
Yeah, thank you so much for asking that question. It's actually the whole reason I wrote that article about carceral logic, because what I had seen in the years doing my work and in talking to people who are abolitionists, it was very clear to me that as much as we like to, and as I locate many of the problems that we see in policing as it currently functions, that any government institution or any private institution for that matter is capable of replicating those same harms. Maybe in a slightly different way, not with a gun or with, not so often actually with incarceration, but perhaps not as frequently. But in really, really harmful ways if that logic persists. Abolitionist Derricka Purnell has said that she would, and she's a fierce opponent of policing and doesn't think that we need it. But she has said that she would rather see a police officer come to her door than a social worker, because social workers have done her family more harm. So think about that. Social workers don't have a gun, they don't have handcuffs, but they have done families more harm. And many families feel that way, right? The family policing system is something that more and more people are talking about. So this logic of controlling people, that these are people that need to be controlled, that need to be coerced, that their problems are because of things like we heard in Ferguson with a personal responsibility or because of moral failings, right? We've seen this throughout our history, that these problems when Black people and Latino people manifest them are because of moral failings or ethical failings, and they need to be sort of, tough loved out of them and put them in jail and teach them a lesson. Whereas when we see those same problems in sort of, white immigrant communities back in the day or in other populations, there's much more of a, this person's down on their luck. We've got to help them. We've got to figure out what's going on. That's the difference between a carceral logic and a caring logic. And so if we can, in any institution is capable of carrying out one or the other. So as we shift some of these functions and we have an alternative first responder going out to a call rather than a police officer, we've got to make sure that that person brings a culture of caring and not a culture of coercion or carceral logic. And unfortunately, people assume that, you're a social worker, you're going to be more caring, you're not going to have that carceral logic. But we know that's not the case. And if we start to shift some of these functions over to these other departments, that's just going to get worse. So we have to be super intentional about recognizing what this logic is how it manifests itself, where it came from, how it gets replicated, so that we don't allow that to happen as we shift so many of these functions from policing to more apt public safety responses.
Well, and that's why I thought your article is just amazing, because it just pushes that conversation away from where kind of a hot topic is, which is always policing, but it then looks into this, how policing logic continues to infest everything else. And I would love to, I mean, we could probably talk about this all day, but we'll end it there. If you have any final words of encouragement or reasons for hope, I'd love to hear them.
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for talking with me, and thank you so much for reading so much of what I've done to be prepared for that. I know it's a lot of work, and I'm humbled and I'm grateful, because I do think it makes for a better conversation. I don't, the only words of hope I have is that I'm quite often discouraged in doing this work. Some days it feels like, one step forward, 2 steps back. But I will say that over the 25 plus years I've been doing this work now, it has gotten better. There is a broader understanding of the need to change. I don't know that it'll keep going that direction every day. I worry about that. But I just, I was talking to a stalwart civil rights attorney today, and she was lamenting the state of affairs in a particular city. And she said, but what is the alternative? And so I do fall back on that. We don't know for sure. I can tell you that it seems to be getting better based on the time I've been doing this work. But what is the alternative? You've got to keep working to try to make it better. Certainly some people in some communities don't have any choice. They just keep working to try to make it better. And I think we owe it to each other to work alongside people to help resolve these problems, not knowing for sure if we'll ever get them fixed.